those of you who are joining for the first time today, Third Path Institute is a national nonprofit celebrating our 20th anniversary. And long before others discovered the importance of including men in the work-life integration discussion, or the science of pushing back at overwhelm so we can all work smarter, we were showing people how to do work, family, and leadership differently. Did you know that over 71,000 people checked out our free resources last year, like the live and recorded versions of our Thursday webinars? We're so glad you're here today. And as you will see on today's webinar in particular, the things that we've learned about for the past 20 years are so relevant during this time of crisis. So I started today's webinar with something many of you might have been seeing, passed around on social media about the truth of what we're all trying to do, or so many of us are trying to do right now, which is basically wear way too many hats, be a parent, a worker, a teacher, caring for an aging person, and trying to navigate very uncharted waters. So today's webinar, I've got three amazing experts to help us think about what we're going through. And if we're lucky, when we get to the end of the webinar, we're going to talk about how this is something we need to be thinking about for ourselves, but beyond ourselves as well. So I've got a little pandemic prayer that someone passed on to me that we'll be talking about towards the end of the webinar as well. But before we get there, I want to welcome the three experts who will be joining us. Alex Durand, I'm so lucky to have on the Third Path board. You will see that he brings incredible wisdom to the issues that we're talking about today, and provides incredible resource to people who are on this journey themselves. I am also pleased to have Lisa Levy join us. Lisa and I go way back. One of the first shared care parents I met. Lisa is doing really exciting work with organizations that she'll be talking about in a little bit too, because part of change needs to happen for us as individuals and in our families, and also change needs to happen at the organizational level. So Lisa, I'm so glad you're here as well. And if that's not good enough, I also have a dear friend, Scott Beeson, joining us. He was somebody who knew how important it was to get the word out that dads could be part of the solution. And he's got a great book out called The Working Dad Survival Guide. So as you can see, we've got three amazing people to help guide us through how are we going to better manage in this crisis, and what can we learn from it that will help us better manage going forward. So as you've heard on some of our previous webinars this year, we know that in order to think differently about work, you also need to think about what's happening at home. And so you can never just think about work in isolation. And depending on where you work, that's going to influence how you're solving work and home too. So we're going to talk a little about how these three factors all are intersectional in this COVID-19 crisis, and how they can either create more opportunity or more challenges for those who are listening in today. And one of the things that people are touting as such an opportunity is that we can now work remotely. And for a long time, Third Path has been talking about how remote work can be a wonderful option. Depending on the type of work you do, you might be able to use this today. But obviously, there are a whole bunch of people who can't work remotely, and so the COVID-19 crisis has hit them very differently. But it's not just about where and when you work and working remotely. It's also about how much work we're doing. And that's something we've talked about way before the COVID-19 crisis, because when you're working remotely or not, sometimes work still takes up too much of our time and energy, and therefore we don't have the time and energy to pay attention to other things that are very important in our lives. So we've always said you need to look at all these different issues when you're thinking about how you can do work differently. But where you work also impacts how this is playing out for you. So I've created a little chart, and Alex and I are going to talk about this together in a second. What it's trying to show you is that some of us are working in a more supportive workplace as we go through this crisis, And as a result, we have a little bit more support in managing both how to work remotely, maybe even our organizations have some experience with remote work, or how to manage how much work we're doing so that we can handle all of our other responsibilities as we're doing this work while in the middle of a COVID-19 crisis. So some of us are in these caring organizations, but some of us are in what we call a work-first workplace. And even in the COVID-19 crisis, the assumption is, you don't care that you have kids at home. You got to get your work done. And that's just an impossible situation. And then there's others who've lost their jobs. And again, this is something we want to talk about when we get to the end of our webinar today. Some of us are lucky enough to work in a supportive workplace, be able to do remote work, and have an organization that supports us to understand we're wearing many hats, and we can figure out how to wear those hats in a way that works best for us and our families, and some aren't. So Alex, you and I have talked a little bit about this ahead of time. You know, what are you seeing around people you've been in contact with around how it plays out with the different types of workplaces that they're working in? How are you seeing this be a more positive or a less positive experience for people's lives right now, Alex? Tell us.
Hi, Jess, and welcome to everybody. Grateful to be sharing this hour with you all. Jess, I think there are two buckets that this slide makes me think of. One is that regardless of whether you are currently in a supportive or a less supportive work culture, most people are experiencing a delocalization of identity. And what I mean by that is we are most of us are used to getting up in the morning, you get dressed, you get out the door, you go to work, and you put on your identity work hat when you leave out the door, and you come back and you might be partner, you might be wife, you might be husband. And then, on the weekend you might see a parent or friends and you put your friend hat on or your son, daughter hat on. So we're used to kind of having these identity borders depending on where we take ourselves. And now for most of us, there's been a collapse of those borders, and we are all finding our identities centralized wherever we live. And so that toggling of identity back and forth, regardless of the support of your workplace, is one of the things that I'm finding folks challenging with the most, because those borders, when they go away, we find that we've gotten so used to kind of segmenting or compartmentalizing certain parts of ourselves to certain environments, that to have them all living in the home creates this kind of gray Play-Doh doll ball that makes it hard to process how we're feeling, and it creates a sense of overwhelm. When you add the work culture component to it, or the culture of your particular workplace, it can either alleviate or it can be an accelerant of the overwhelm. If you happen to be in a work culture that is being empathetic, that is really being proactive and not reactive, there's a chance that you might get an opportunity to take a breath, to have your kids come in while you're on webcam, or your parent walk in while you're on webcam, or your father or mother-in-law while you're on webcam, and kind of laugh it off and be okay. If you're in a close or work first environment and they are being reactive, they're being less supportive, then that's kind of like pouring gasoline on the fire, and the overwhelm becomes even more intense. So I think there's two components to this. One is how our identities have kind of collapsed into the home, and then how our individual work cultures either relieve some of that, some of the pressure in the pot, or it actually intensifies it.
Oh, wow. I knew you'd get us off in a good start. So I was inspired by your words to kind of think about this picture again. And so it's kind of like, who we are as individuals can really impact us, is what I'm hearing you talk about. So, for example, I've always been someone who really does better kind of working in very separate ways. So when I'm parenting, I'm parenting. When I'm working, I'm working. My husband is more of a, mix the two together person, always has been more comfortable that way. He's been able to do work in the kitchen, help kids with homework, cook dinner all at once. And so somebody like me, let's imagine I was in a smaller house, and suddenly I couldn't separate, and I'd be in this space where I'm mixing life and family all together. I could still go to my office right now and feel separate, but for somebody who's in a smaller space, likes to have things separate, they're not going to have that opportunity right now, and that can be very, very difficult. So thank you for pointing that out. That's really helpful. And depending on your workplace, again, some are going to be more supportive of the fact that you're going to have a kid wandering around in the back room. My husband literally walked into a group call that I was doing the other day. Luckily, he knew most of the people, so it wasn't a problem. But I really hear you that, just how this feels for us as individuals is going to be very different, in addition to the kind of workplace we're working in. So I want to talk more about the workplace in a second, but what else would you like to add about that? That's such a great way to start, Alex. Thank you for that.
The only other thing I'd say for for the moment being is that there's a lot of conversation about what's going to happen when this is quote unquote all over. What's the new normal going to look like? What's the future going to look like? And there's a lot of conversation around uh, how this crisis is going to change the future. And I would say, people who I've been listening to, who I trust, um, that they really convinced me that it's not about how this will change the future, but how crises are really accelerants of the future. So whatever was going to take 10, 15 years might collapse into a few years, into a few months. And so, if your boss liked to micromanage you when you were sitting in the office, or in a FaceTime culture, and then after all this, they moved to allowing you to work from home, you better believe that that boss didn't have a revelation and is going to want to micromanage you even more once you're virtual. And so I think we need to be careful when we talk about change and culture change, because I still believe that the Peter Drucker quote of "culture will eat change for breakfast" is pretty timeless. And so if you had an organization that was pretty face-to-face oriented, micromanaging oriented, maybe not hostile, but challenging in terms of drawing your own personal boundaries. And then they move to a virtual or more flexible arrangement once this is all over. That culture is not going to change. It's just going to show up in a new context. And so I think we need to be careful when I'm cautiously optimistic, but I think we have to have better conversations about how to continue to shift cultures and not just implement policies and think that that is enough of a change to change the culture at work.
Amen to that. Wow. Thank you. Again, I knew you'd get us off in the right direction. So one of the things that Alex is talking about is something I hope we'll keep on circling back to: how to continue to shift cultures. Because one of the things we really believe at Third Path is cultures change because people are changing inside that culture. Hence why we've done so much work to help leaders think differently, because when leaders are thinking differently, they model something differently, which then gives the green light for everybody else to try something differently. And so we've really seen that over and over again with this crisis. There was this amazing experience a month ago when we had our last webinar, where I put out a call to some of my progressive leaders and said, hey, are you ready for the possibility that you might be doing 100% virtual work? And no surprise, a lot of Third Path leaders were very prepared, and they were already organized around it. Then we found some of the Third Path leaders who were, they cared, but it was still going to be a jump for them to really do remote work, for their organizations to do remote work. But interestingly, those pockets of leaders inside those organizations who'd already tried remote work became the resource to help that organization go to remote work. So we kept on seeing there were leaders out there who were already doing this, and those leaders were helping their organizations be ready or be more ready for the crisis that was coming. And I just want to mention a shout out to this group of people, because the other thing I learned is you could even be a caring leader, but the truth is you really had employees who were essential service people, or employees where you were dealing with a lot of seniors, um, or employees in a high trauma location, and you could have all the care in the world and it was still going to be very, very challenging given the kind of work that your organization was doing. And so many of those people are still, those leaders in those organizations, they care, and it's been really challenging for them. There might not be anything you want to add to that, but if you did, Alex, please feel free. Otherwise, we're going to go on to kind of thinking about this more from the home side next. Anything else, Alex?
No, I love your point about shouting out and really honoring essential services and people working in healthcare, and everybody else that we don't think about, the plumbers, the folks coming out to the home to take care of emergencies when people have them, and 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 just really understanding that some of the discussions that we're having here are so different from those who are still putting their lives out on the line so that we can all be safe. So
Yeah,
thank you to everybody.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. We can't forget that. Some of us can do it differently, but not all of us can do it differently. But that said, what someone told me, which was really helpful, was to remind us being, a beacon of how we can do work and home differently is going to help those organizations that are curious about thinking about differently, those leaders who are curious about doing it differently. And as we started out this webinar, we talked about how it's not just what's happening at work, it's also what's happening at home. And so I'm going to go through a couple of slides around what's happening at home, and then we're going to get Scott and Lisa to talk about this. Both of them are great examples of people who have done this very differently in their own lives, and also really become experts in helping other people think about how to do both work and home differently too. So one of the things you've probably heard us talk about on the Thursday webinar way too many times, but it's just such a basic truth, is that the more you're clear yourself about what you want, and then you can get on the same page with your partner, even if that partner, you and your partner are separated or divorced, because we can see this happen with shared care families who are divorced as well, that when you're clear and your partner are clear, then together you can think about how to address the more challenging external factors. That boss who isn't very supportive, that workplace is not very supportive. And so that's just a really important starting point for all family systems. We also created a kind of little, blow by blow for this particular moment in time, that if you're trying to create a team approach, that you need to take the "we can figure this out together" attitude, and that what we have to remember is each family is going to be different. Some have younger kids, some have older kids, some have aging parents, some have all the above. And depending on your particular unique needs of your family, then coming up with some sort of common schedule to manage this past month and the next month as we get through this crisis. Then, again, depending on your kids' age, get your kids involved with what the schedule is. Help them understand it. I was talking to one parent where there was a new pattern being developed in their home. The kids kept on turning to her for help, and by putting a schedule up, it was really made more clear that both mom and dad could be the resource when there was help needed. And then you're going to need to keep on talking about this, because obviously we're all learning as we go through this, and everything keeps on changing. And so literally this past weekend with my husband and my son, who's 23 and home with us, we literally sat down and talked some more about, okay, given the latest changes, how do we want to approach shopping, food, managing things as we get through the next month. But most importantly, and I hope we have time to talk about this, I have some slides at the very end of today's webinar, is that you need to make sure you keep on building in some recharge time for yourself and your family, whatever that looks like. And so those are some basics around, what we're thinking about as people get through this crisis at home. What these little batteries are trying to remind us is that no matter what family system you were before, whether you were a family system where you were both working full time, or maybe one of you flexed your job, or maybe one of you stayed home full time, you're probably now a family system where all hands are on deck. And so, how can we best manage when we've become this family system where all hands are on deck? So, I'm going to check in with Scott and then with Lisa. What have you been learning as you watch some of the people you know go through this crisis, Scott? And what have you been learned yourself around making it work, around work and family, when, like a game of 52 pickup, everything got thrown up in the air and now we're trying to figure it all out again? Scott, what have you been learning?
Yeah, well, first off, hi everybody. Thank you for having me. Yeah, it has been really interesting times, and again, I'm so fortunate that I can just, you know, call this interesting as opposed to, really life-threatening or anything. But I've my son is a freshman in high school. My wife is a theater actress and director, so her industry has disappeared. Um, I'm a university professor and we're continuing on just teaching online. Um, so my schedule is relatively the same as it used to be, which is, of course, my schedule was never really a traditional schedule. It, really flexed around my classes and meetings and things like that. And there's some things about work that are actually far better. My university has automated a ton of processes such as expense reports and all these performance review files and financial matters in reaction to the fact that they cannot cut physical checks. So how do we make sure people get expenses? So these are some lasting changes in the workplace. So I just wanted to add that to what Alex was saying, that that really could be helpful for everybody going forward. But in terms of home, um, since my life has a little more structure, my son is generally been given like, here's your work for the week in each of his classes and occasional, online check-ins. And then my wife is trying to attend to other aspects of her career that is other than performance or auditioning. Um, but my wife and son are night owls and they're going to bed later and they're sleeping later. And it's getting to the point where they're not going to bed before 1 or 2 and they're not getting up before 10 or 11. And that makes me feel a little weird, but it works for them. My son is getting all his stuff done because, we sat down and had him have a plan and a schedule for that. My wife's getting all her stuff done as well. But I think, my need for a little more structure is higher than theirs. So we had to meet in the middle because I was annoying them too much about trying to get everything on a schedule. And we determined that we all have to do these 6 things every day. And as long as we do these 6 things every day, we're okay. And I actually put it up on our wall right outside our living room. And it says something for work and school. That's number 1. Number 2, fun using a screen, and that could be, on computer or TV. Fun without a screen, and that could be playing a board game, using the backyard, etc. Family time. So, we are eating dinners together just about every night, and then playing a game or watching things together. Spending a good chunk of family time together. Have some outdoor / exercise time, whether it's a bike ride around the neighborhood or just a walk or something like that. And then something social. So we have a phone call with somebody or, a virtual hangout with some of our friends or something like that. As long as we do these kind of 6 things every day, I think we're kind of keeping ourselves kind of okay. Again, it's a little easier for me. My son's older, he's turning 15 soon. He can take care of his own things. When you have littler kids, this must be much more difficult. When you are, especially littler kids, like in early, second grade,
Yep.
you have to be very involved in the education of your child right now, and we might not be equipped to do that or have the bandwidth
Yeah.
to do that. So
Yeah.
that's, that. So there are some challenges that are particular to your situation. Other thing, I deal a lot with, obviously I teach college students, and a lot of them are living at home unexpectedly, expecting to have been in the dorms and everything. And these are emerging adults who have this real strong need to assert their independence, and now they're put into a situation where they're not as independent as they would like to be. And I know a lot of them they love their parents. Their parents love them, but there's a lot of tension and clashing going on because, people's needs and where they were in their lives have kind of, gone against some of their expectations. So,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
you know, so those are just some things that I've observed, and I have some advice about work from home and things like that, but I think the um, the it's more important to ask the right questions because everybody's situation is going to be somewhat different.
Yeah. And you
So
know what I liked about what you did, Scott, was, and this is universal, in your family, what you did was acknowledge that you all have slightly different approaches,
yeah,
and to find that approach that worked, that middle ground that worked for you and your wife and son, because I think that's something all families are dealing with right now. We probably are attracted to somebody as our partner because they do have a different style than us. And so now we're suddenly, spending a lot of time in a little tiny space all together. And it's trying to be respectful of those differences and find that common ground approach. So I love the fact that you guys came up with that middle ground. We had the same thing happen in our house around how we handle food, because each of us would handle
mm,
food so differently if we were in charge of it. So that's great. And I
yeah,
want
and
to put a
yeah,
shout. Go ahead.
just if
Yep.
just one last thing to put a button on that. So my son has about 3 hours or so of schoolwork per day. That's what it's kind of
Hmm.
averaging out to. And initially, when it's like it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon and he's barely gotten started, and that causes me stress, right? Because that's not how
Yep.
I would work. But it's fine. I mean, it doesn't matter if he gets his stuff done at 6, by 6 o'clock. It doesn't matter, right?
Yep.
As long as he gets it done. And I've had to kind of let go of some of
Yes.
that, and
Yes.
you know, I recognize that, I've always preached this kind of flexible kind of approach to work and family. And, when I'm confronted with, I have to do this too, it's always, it's kind of interesting. It takes me a little bit longer to adjust to these things than I would like, but I do feel that I get there. So, all right.
Sounds like you and I are the ones who like an organized schedule in our families, and our spouses are the more flexible ones.
Yeah.
So, but it's good to have that combination. And
Yep.
you're also reminding me, we're gonna go hear from Lisa next. You're reminding me also that there is this thing around with teens and college age students around independence. And interestingly enough, our webinar next month is with Christine Carter, who's got a new book out about teenage years. And I think it's going to be very applicable to college students, teenagers, and how you think about these issues with that older group who's trying to have some independence, wants to be social, and here we are in lockdown in our family's homes. So thank you for raising that issue too. That's great. Wonderful. Well, and Lisa, I know that you come at this from so many different angles, not just because you've been an amazing shared care parent, you and Brian, but also because you've been in there helping organizations think about how to support men to be involved in care work and how that's going to help change our organizations as well. Where would you like to begin, Lisa, around how to help parents think about this at home, or how to help organizations think about what's happening at home to make change for men and women?
I'm Lisa Levy, everybody, and I thought I would speak a little bit from the organizational perspective. And honestly, one of, I think, the really good things about it is, and what's hard is, why do we have to wait for such a horrendous crisis? But as somebody who probably more than 20 years ago was doing work around flexibility and writing flexibility policies for big companies, and obviously a lot of companies do embrace that now, at least to some extent. There are many that the attitude is still very biased towards in person is always better. And so I think this is going to open a door in a way that's powerful, because, we can't see, and there are limitations about being remote. There are pluses and minuses to all things. But I think for some people, it's going to really open a door. And a good friend of mine who works at a law firm, who, was really trying to make the case for somebody to go on a remote schedule, with some time in the office. And this firm for, over 100 years never has allowed anyone to go remotely.
Yeah.
Well, here you have it. And all of a sudden it's like, hey, that's really great. And, there's some ways you could be more productive. And so people just have such inertia and resistance to some things. So I do think that the one sort of a silver lining is it's going to open up that discussion even further about how we work. The other piece that I think is sort of the real positive is, you know, people's lives are their dogs and their kids, and I think there's something that really humanizes things when that happens. And so I think we can be so, okay, I'm in my workspace and my, whatever. I mean, you don't want those things mixing all the time, but I think there's something very humanizing to have some of that. And so that's, I think, another very positive kind of strange thing about this moment in time and having to respond so much to this. So, I think that I hope organizations are going to be more intentional about, how would we deal with these kind of things? I mean, it reminds me of 9/11 and, in the future, because obviously we have lived through some of them.
I loved your points too, Lisa, about how this is an opportunity, and that workplaces will now be thinking differently. That workplace that was so resistant will now have had an experience where people were working remotely successfully, and that's going to really hopefully shape a different future. So that's where we want to go next, is to talk about work. And again, when we're trying to think about how to do work, family, during this crisis of the COVID-19 crisis, you need to think about all these different factors. What's your workplace? What's happening at home? And what's the kind of work you do? And in particular, what we try to teach people is to look for something we call a triple win. When you're trying to find an answer around how do you do your work, you try to find an answer that works well for you. It works well for how to get your work done. That's why some people can't do remote work, because their work doesn't allow them to do remote work. And it also works well for your colleagues and clients. So that's where we want to go next, is to think a little bit about.
Yes,
please.
I wanted to say one thing that I think could be really valuable to folks, and it's just very timely.
Yes.
I was just interviewing someone this morning who has an autistic child, and she was saying in some ways this is much easier for him because he doesn't have all these other routines to deal with. But the, I think, more relevant connection here is, she talked about she's divorced and her husband works in professional baseball. And so normally at this time of the year, he literally has the son who is 9, I think, 1 weekend a month. And otherwise she's it. Because of all this and the season's canceled, he's now taking the son for these big, long periods of time. And she said it's been building in a great way. And she said, I don't think any of this would ever happen, if we hadn't gotten divorced. I think, it was very jaded in terms of who did what, but she was talking so much about how wonderful it's been for her husband and how proud she's been about, he used to be very nervous around their son who was autistic and, requires some different things. And so anyway, it was such a wonderfully powerful story. And it goes back to that, having people try different things and having people be in charge. I think this is a moment for people to also experiment with different home roles. It's so powerful, and we're kind of all squished in, but I think it's a real opportunity at the same time.
Yeah. I want to piggyback on that too, that I've heard from a number of the groups we run where we've been introducing people to how to develop their integration skills. We call them our overwhelm mitigation groups. There's a number of dads on those calls who are now working from home, and they're just so enjoying the time they have with their kids, and they don't really want to return to that same schedule they had post-COVID-19. So I think you're so right, Lisa. Thank you for that truthful, positive attitude. I like it. All right, so we're watching the clock and keeping an eye on the need to think a little bit about, so how do we think about things on the work side? We've hopefully given you a sense that you can look at your workplace, put it in a sense of perspective, how much support you get there, what's happening at home, what are our unique needs, how can we work together there, and then what kind of work do we do, and how can we make some change? And the big message around this is if you are working remotely right now and it's the possibility for you to keep on working remotely later because you're enjoying it and you want some piece of your work week done remotely or all of it done remotely, the trick is to start getting into a pattern of communicating well right now around what you're working on and having really good lines of communication with the people you work with around what you're working on and how you're making progress. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. I kind of see it as an ongoing circle and cycle of communication because you're no longer bumping into somebody in the hallway. Instead, you're being more intentional about letting someone know how you're making progress on the different activities you're responsible for. So I was going to talk with Alex and then Lisa to think a little about what advice can we give people as they're trying to think about how to manage up while they're working remotely so that perhaps they have more success being able to keep on working remotely later if that's their goal. So Alex, when you think about working with people who maybe for the first time are working remotely or want to keep on working remotely, what have you learned that's helped them be more successful there? What advice do you have for them?
Yeah, the first step that I find is really helpful for folks when I work with them through this is there's two parts. One is you have to understand, you have to take some time to reflect on the context of your team or your group specifically. And then you have to get clear on what do you think are your own individual needs to manage and work better through this. It could be anything from you have somebody on your team or you yourself is experiencing higher than normal anxiety or chronic stress because of where you are in the country, in the world, because of concern for a parent or a relative, whatever the context may be. You're likely operating at a different baseline than you normally are. And then there's your role and the dynamic of your individual team. If you are used to everybody communicating on Slack or over email, you need to understand like how are messages coming into me? How am I delivering the pieces that I owe? And so the first step is to really get clear on like what do I owe? What do different members of my team owe me? Like it helps to actually write your name on the center of a page and do almost like a traditional mind map, but where you connect lines to the tasks that you are responsible for and the people associated with that task. If your leader isn't doing these kinds of activities, it might be important for you to step up and manage up or to lead by example. But to really show even over virtual your teammates to be like, hey, I drew this. Like, this is how I see it. How do you guys see it? I'm getting stuck on this little bubble over here and this particular connect. Like, where are you guys getting stuck? It's really hard to diagnose or make improvements to a system if you don't know where the roadblocks are. So one of the really complicated things here is, your teammates and your boss are going to have different preferences in terms of how they communicate this. So the best thing you can do is really approach this one, make the offer to be like, hey, I'm struggling with this and this part. Who's open to talking about it? Who's open to working with me on it? And working with that group of people. And what that does is if you get a couple of people to buy into what you want to do to improve the efficiency and performance of your particular team, you'll see that other people will either start to come in, or you'll realize who are the real roadblocks in improving the efficiency. So understand the context of your particular work situation, and then understand your particular needs, and have in mind like an experiment that you'd like to try. It's great to diagnose, but it's even better when somebody comes to the table with an experiment that they think might be helpful to the dynamic of the group.
Yeah. So as I listen to you, it's almost like I'm going to draw something completely different on this picture, where you're really talking about there might be a team out there many teams out there where they're just learning for the first time how to work remotely. And so they just need some space to pay attention to the cycle of work and is it working? And even before that, you mentioned some of us might be feeling overwhelmed and just personally having a hard time. And so how do we as individuals, as a team, support each other through this change? So you're talking about this great opportunity that you were working in a different way. And if each of us are paying attention to what's working, not working, there could be a way to actually notice these opportunities for change and collectively make a shift for all of us to work better. And so I like that. And you can do that as an individual employee, thinking about what's working for you personally, and then sharing that with your wider team. So that's great. I hadn't even thought about this general opportunity to think differently about how are we getting our work done? Is it working well for me and for our team? And playing a role in helping improve things that way, Alex. That's awesome. Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, can I just?
So we're looking at the getting closer to the end of our webinar. That doesn't mean we're at the end of our topics. I wanted to make sure I gave Lisa a chance to think a little bit about what people need to be thinking about as an employee, managing themselves and making the most of how they're getting their work done right now. There's something you wanted to add to this discussion, Lisa, before we talk about the last, and I don't want to get lost, important point of how do we take care of ourselves in the middle of all this, which is going to be the last topic we talk about. Lisa, anything you want to talk about with work and employees managing themselves?
Yeah, I just want to say I think the points of Alex and Scott are really fantastic, both of them. And I was going to say, if you're an employee and you want to set any stage for doing this down the road, I think the more proactive you are, and that was discussed by other folks, so I won't repeat that. But if you show proactively, this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm accomplishing, this is where I am, there's no manager that is not going to really like that, even the kind that are very micromanaging by style. The piece I was going to bring up goes right to your point, Jessica, which is I think it can be I know it can be even harder to have any boundaries in this environment because you don't have to, leave at a certain time. And so I think that's the harder thing actually for most people is not underworking. I think for many, many people it's overworking. And so I think that's kind of getting clarity yourself about, whatever. That's a really hard one, but like when is enough, because a lot of times there's more work than any of us can do. So as someone who I know I struggle with this personally by temperament, I think that's a really important piece of the puzzle.
Yeah. In fact, thank you for raising that because remote work or not, there's always more work to do than time to do it in. And I think that's what we're don't have time to talk about in a big way right now, but that's an opportunity that you can work on. We have a great case study on our website of CJ, where he worked with his manager to think a little bit about what was his most important work, and to really create a routine check-in time to talk about what's the most important work, because then people are able to stay focused and get the most important things done, and then hopefully leave time and energy for the rest of their lives. And when CJ approached his work this way, where he really managed up and thought about what's the most important work, it really helped improve the work he was doing as well. So that is often the opportunity, is to really work with our managers to focus on what's important and then keep communicating about how you're making progress around that so that you can really feel that there's combined success in your goals together around work. Wonderful. Okay, so as we get to the last few slides, I just want to say that as Lisa was talking about, boundaries do help us think smarter because when we're not exhausted and overwhelmed, we can think smarter. And so we need, yes, time for work, yes, time for life, and in this point, schooling our kids sometimes too, but it's really important to think about how we can also find some recharge time. And so, I was really surprised to notice how this past weekend was so important to really create time for us as a family to step away from work, think about other things, and try to recharge and recenter ourselves as we got through this crisis. So as we wrap up, our thoughts on today's webinar. We've been thinking about how you need to look at both the organizations we look in, what's happening at home, how we're managing our work. I also want us to share a thought about how we can recharge. And I'm going to go through Alex, then, I'm going to go through Lisa, then Scott, then Alex to talk a little bit about recharge time. Last but not least, I want to remember that not all of us have the same opportunities. So as we're closing, I want us to remember that there's a bunch of other people out there who are struggling around this, and we have those to remember as well. So Lisa, as we wrap up, when you think a little bit more about how to help people recharge, how to think about this larger experience we're all going through, what are some last insights you want to share?
So from personal experience, I will say it's having to keep telling yourself that giving yourself a break is the smartest thing you can do. You know, it makes you so much more productive and it makes you happier, and it doesn't come naturally to some people. But it's, I mean, like, you just got to keep telling yourself it is so not helping your cause by just keeping your head down.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, it's okay, you know, there's all this advice about, oh, you could use this as an opportunity to learn a new language or learn these new skills and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, that's entirely too much pressure. I think we need to get through this. You know, that's enough, right? Getting through this is enough. And I think we need to, you know, give ourselves the space to take that pressure off. And, you know, my natural inclination is to work more. And, you know, I don't want to get into my whole story, but my story includes getting back to the United States during all of this and teaching classes at 2 different universities remotely at the same time. And, you know, so I had this huge tsunami of extra work and stress over the last month or so. And I had just, you know, worked through it. I took last weekend and I did nothing, and it was everything that I hoped it could be. It was, you know, it was really, really necessary. And I think the other thing, you know, I was talking about, you know, the 6 things everyone in my family needs to do every day. You know, part of that is getting outdoors since we can, doing a little bit of exercise, doing something a little social, whether it's just calling one of your college friends you haven't talked to in 3 months, or talking to your, you know, other family members, or playing a game with your family for 40 minutes. You know, we could carve out little bits of time for some of that renewal, even though it's hard. You know, I think Lisa said it perfectly. We have to, you know, we have to be okay for ourselves before we could be okay for others. So, you know, we need to take that time.
No, thank you, Lisa and Scott, for really encouraging that we need to take care of ourselves, find some time for ourselves, recharge. Alex, is there one last thought you want to share about any of this?
I echo what both Lisa and Scott said, and I'll just add, you know, anchor yourself to your own little joys, whatever your own little quirky joys are. Indulge in them wherever you can. You know, I just recently started rewatching a Japanese anime cartoon that makes me laugh and cry within 20 minutes, and I find that therapeutic. And it's something that I haven't watched in a long time. But you know what? It's like my partner will come in from work and she'll be like, "Why are you crying again?" And I'll be like, "This Japanese cartoon's done it to me again." And so like, just find ways to laugh at yourself. Find your own little escapisms are so important right now, and whatever is your own joyful indulgement, whether books, TV, board games, whatever it is, just find your own little anchoring joys.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. And I will say the one thing that I've really found really helpful, because I think all of us can feel like we're surviving and also so aware that there's so many other people out there who are having it even harder. And so for me, one thing that I found that's been really helpful for me as I get through this crisis is to find some people who I can call and talk to and be both very honest about how sad I am, about how painful this is for so many people right now. There's parts of our population that are really going to be seriously worse off from all of this. And I've had to find space for people to listen to me about that, and also to remind me that me living and trying to make change well in my own life and those around me is also important in addition to that. And they can go hand in hand. I can feel for the fact that there's this real injustice happening. And I can also march forward in the work of trying to show the world that we can do work differently, we can do family differently, we can create different organizations, and doing that is part of the healing that we need as well. They can go hand in hand. So thank you, everybody. I hope you hear that the opportunity ahead of you and taking care of yourself through that opportunity could make this world a better place. If you have interest in sticking around and asking our panelists some questions, we're hoping they can stay a little bit longer and answer your questions. Thanks so much for being part of today's webinar. Okay, Andy, I think we stopped the webinar.